Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Sophie Reynard-Leroy, and I am the director of the Institute for Globalization Studies at Stony Brook University in the College of Arts and Sciences. Welcome to our third and last event of the fall season, Transregional Ties That Bind, Men of Power and Men of Learning across early modern Persianate Asia, with our distinguished guest, Dr. Mana Kia from Columbia University. This fall series, let me remind you, for those who may not have attended the previous two talks, is dedicated to globalization across time and place, which my colleague, Dr. Rosabelle Ansari, fellow at our Institute for Globalization Studies, and I designed together. We started our season's lecture series in September with a guest from Yale University, Dr. Valerie Hansen, who presented Globalization in Year 1000, after her recent book, attempting to situate globalization as a phenomenon in the medieval times and around China. Then in October, last month, we hosted Dr. Miguel Martinez from the University of Chicago, who spoke about colonial Manila and the early modern globalization. Dr. Ansari will be introducing you to our guest today. Rosabelle is a medievalist specialized in Islamic studies. As the grand organizer of this series, she'll be moderating the event. Our mission this fall semester has been to introduce you to a facet of globalization that tends to be overseen, its early modern origins and articulation beyond the West. And today's focus is late Mughal India. It is my pleasure now to let my Institute for Globalization Studies colleague and fellow, Rosabelle Ansari, introduce today's guest.
Hi, thank you, Sophie. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Mana Kia, who is an associate professor in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. She is the author of numerous academic articles and pieces of public scholarship on identity, ethics, and place in the Persianate world. Her first book, entitled Persianate Selves, Memories of Place and Origin Before Nationalism, was published last year by Stanford University Press. She has given numerous book talks, and we are lucky to have her here today to discuss some of her newest research on transregional ties that bind men of power and men of learning across early modern Persianate Asia. After her talk, I will invite our very own Dr. Mohammed Balan, Assistant Professor of Medieval History at Stony Brook, to offer some of his thoughts and reflections on the talk. And after that, I will open up to Q&A for the whole audience. Thank you, and I pass the floor to Dr. Kia.
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here today. And here, let me just get my PowerPoint up. So thank you to Rosabelle and to Stony Brook's Institute for Globalization Studies. And thank you also to Mohammed Balan for acting as respondent. So this talk is part of a larger project about politically and socially significant forms of companionship that I argue undergirded early modern Persianate societies across Central, South, and West Asia. Forms shared because they were interwoven with the broader interregional circulation of texts, people, practices, and ideas. These student-teacher, patron-client, ruler-servant, master-disciple relationships were articulated in the language of love and friendship, and their practices enacted modes of companionship or sohbat. So in this talk, I'm going to focus on relationships between men of learning and men of power in late Mughal India against the background of this relationship's long and deep history. So Persianate polities cohered around hierarchically structured social bonds, linking individuals and groups marked by dissimilar origins, religious affiliations, social locations, occupational groupings, and claims to power. These relations of service and patronage were spoken of in terms of love and friendship, which brought together the elite and less so, men and not men, as well as legal kin and those related by customary bonds alone. Because of the way the political grew out of the social in times of political devolution or collapse, social bonds could stabilize localities, maintain regional linkages, and provide continuity and coherence in unstable times. So understanding the central role of sociability and social bonds, the intimacy that defined them, and the interaction they engendered is crucial for understanding transregional familiarity, social circulation, and political formation. And this last point is of particular importance for me, since practices of sohbat, which is a word that can mean conversation or companionship, in fact constituted the very possibility of good governance. This unequivocal association is a starting point, I think, for thinking past Eurocentric frameworks for understanding pre-modern states, such as patrimonialism, and brings some necessary pressure to bear on the so-called global early modern, which always begins with European terms, categories, and avenues of inquiry. So to realize and render these forms of companionship legible required the enactment of particular bodily practices, as well as the production and exchange of images, compositions, books, and objects. Thus, in addition to historicizing unhelpfully modern and obfuscating assumptions about servitude and freedom, the individual and social difference, the understanding that many of our texts and material sources were products of bonded relations suggests new ways for us to receive and engage with them. So just to give everyone the background of the context in which I'm speaking, from roughly the 13th to the early 19th century, Persian was a language of power and learning across Central, South, and West Asia, used for government, philosophy, religious instruction, historical commemoration, storytelling, poetry, and ethical literature. As a result, a heavy and continuous circulation of people, texts, practices, and ideas connected Persianate Asia. Now, this mobility was embedded within other types of flows, other kinds of trade relationships, Indian Ocean travel routes, pilgrimage routes, etc. Right? So I'm not making some kind of claim for hermetic sort of routes and realms of exchange. But I do think that it's important to kind of note that Persians were a kind of person who had received a particular form of basic education that imparted the Persianate, a certain kind of way through which they understood and engaged with the world. So Persian was a textual corpus whose encapsulated meanings also lived and circulated orally in stories and verse for broader audiences. Now, a paramount concept that I use here that defines the Persianate is its adab, which is a term that I define as the proper aesthetic and ethical form of things, right? So adab was the means by which Persians could realize themselves as ethical subjects through relationships with the world, enacted in their appropriate forms. Now, obviously, other languages in the worlds of Islam had this concept of adab, but one of the things that's specific to it is the way in which it's animated, particularly in a textual corpus and language tradition. One of the primary avenues of generating an honorable self was from within relations of servitude and bondage, which in turn provided sustenance, support, protection, and beneficence. However, given our own modern location and its assumptions about bondage and service, as a thing quite apart from love and friendship, it's necessary to peel back some layers. And so in what follows, I'm going to address three main points. The first is going to be the relationship between friendship and service. The second, looking specifically at the relationship between men of power and men of learning that straddles both. And third, how the practices of companionship were vital to governance historically and how they may challenge our historical practices. So we identify service most often with hierarchy as a reciprocal relation of unequal power. In contrast, we associate friendship with an equality that allows it to stand apart from the coercions of power and ideally from a presumed self-interest. Thus, we assume that love pervades friendship, but not service, because power and coercion are inimical and corrupting. For love and friendship to be true, therefore, They must be disinterested from realms of power. But more recent scholarship has shown us two important things: that friendship was publicly significant and that it was formal. But even the most robust scholarship on friendship in European context understands friendship as an informal type of relationship, however significant to the workings of power and politics it might be. This insistence on its informality, even in the wake of Alan Bray's path-breaking book, leaves untouched our modern assumptions about the undesirability of informal workings in the public sphere. So lack of formality here usually means lack of regulation, systematization, predictability, and by extension, rationality and justice. But the distinguishing markers of what makes something formal or not are measured only as legal or administrative structures and policies, even in the study of earlier periods. So following Alan Bray, who wrote a really important book called The Friend, that deals with European and mainly English histories of friendship, valuable work has been done by Emma Flatt and Daoud Ali, showing us that unlike instrumentality and expectations of mutual cooperation in South Asia need not be masked. So focusing on the connected Persianate Bahmani Deccan and Central Asian Timurid context, Emma Flatt shows that, and I'm quoting her, friends were expected to help each other actively in their pursuit of education, mercantile opportunities, employment, and patronage, largely by means of advice, preferment, recommendations, introductions, and contacts. So formal friendships were serious life commitments. They functioned politically as relations both of loyalty and of intimacy, reflecting, quote, an ideal companionship in the context of service, according to which one's social self took form. This was a form of sociability inaugurated by various ritual acts, including sharing a meal and other forms of material and commemorative exchange and acknowledgement that had significant political meaning as well. In more than one tradition, also devotion to a superior, even to God, was spoken of in terms of friendship, right? So the Awliya are God's friends, right? So moreover, and here I'm quoting Emma Flatt again, rather than an exclusive private relationship, therefore, friendship was an open act, a demonstration to contemporaries as much as to oneself of the extent to which one was embedded within a web of alliances, allegiances, and supporters. So in other words, social bonds linked people to each other, but in polyadic networks that required enactment of proper aesthetic and ethical forms, adab, and negotiation of the obligations of different relationships, right? Because you were always involved with more than one. Bonds with a superior, whether teacher, commander, overlord, king, or Sufi guide, fostered more horizontal solidarities. They created the potential for hierarchical and horizontal linkages between individuals over lines of difference as well. And it's worth stating that rather than existing in spite of hierarchy, Daoud Ali describes affection and camaraderie did not simply traverse the boundaries of a hierarchical service relationship, but happily inhabited the structure. Thus, unlike the European context, the facade of disinterest was not necessary or understood as inimical to expressions of intimacy and affection. So however disparate they may seem in terms of political location, power, and intimacy, friendship and service are actually on a continuum with one another and with a whole host of other relationships. Indeed, the meanings of friendship could overlay and characterize a variety of relationships we consider other. They certainly were distinct, but friendship's expressions of love and practices of intimacy shaped their forms of exchange, obligation, and rights. And so to help me convey a sense of the continuum of relationships, I'm going to rely on some images, although I won't be able to do them justice, and I'm going to go through them fairly quickly. But let me start with some relationships we're more used to seeing, right? And this is usually titled as Two Young Lovers Burn Marks, right? And here you can see the beloved burning marks into the arm of the lover while he gazes at her. And there's a lot you could say about this image, but I think the most important thing is the decanter and wine bowl in the far right corner, indicating the presence of passionate love, as wine transforms as love does. But that's not the only kind. Here is the epitome of beauty, the attractive beardless youth beguiling the Safavid Shah Abbas. And here we have the presence of the wine again, so you know what's going on. And here is Agha Mirak Tabrizi, the painter, and Shah Tahmas, who was in, Mirak was the intimate companion of the Shah and a master painter in his service, but they also grew up together. And here they're shown as youths clasping hands. And together they gaze at a safina, or a collection of poetry, which is at the kind of center of the painting. And this reminds us that texts were part of representations of friendships, and that reading together was an activity of companionship. But further out from this, right, we have student-teacher relationships as children, and then scenes of learning later in life. And we also have scenes of conviviality constituted dyadically by multiple bonds across traditions. We also have, we've seen shows of affection between princes, though notice how there's always an audience of onlookers, an entourage. And this is, there are other famous friendships commemorated by those who only met in paintings. And this is the Emperor Jahangir and the Safavid Shah Abbas, who had never actually met. And here paintings enact the meetings that bodies could not. And I think it's important to note that friendships were not just enjoyed and represented by the high, they included more modest sorts of people, such as companions working together. And this is a Colophon painting of the Hamsa of Nizami. And the painter is Dolat, and the scribe is Abdul Rahim. The kind of, you know, the two are respectively engaging in their occupations, and the eye is drawn again to the various types of books at the center of the painting. And this is a close-up. Dolat was attached to Prince Salim, who later became Jahangir, the Mughal emperor. So I think that the really important point to make, though, is that these relationships were not merely dyadic, but they were part of collectives, right? So differences of status and stature within social bonds made it so these relations were marked by particular rights and restrictions. And to understand Persianate political and social ethics, we need to dispense with assumptions that valorize equality and linked them with stark distinctions between free and unfree, around which so much European thought revolves. If we consider the fundamental nature of social bonds more broadly on a continuum with what we've been given to call slavery, but I would like to call bondage, we can understand how ideal forms of Persianate societies and their hierarchies of dependency were predicated on bonds that provided the connective tissue of governance. To be within some sort of bondage was normal, and in fact, to be free of bonds that embedded one socially was to be abject, regardless of jural stature. So I'm going to give some actual examples, and one is that there are a lot of texts that deal with these kinds of relationships and the importance of sociability in general. And one example is the widely read 13th century work of moral philosophy, Akhlaq al-Nasiri, which explains that natural fellowship is one of the properties of men, and insomuch as the perfection of anything lies in the manifestation of its property, so too the perfection of man lies in the manifestation of this property to its own kind. This property is the principle of love, mahabbat, calling forth urbanity, tamaddun, and social synthesis. Elaborating how Islam attends to this practice of perfection through congregational prayers, pilgrimage, and other communal practices, Tusi adds that, quote, men have been urged to combine in both devotions and convivial gatherings. For in society, the above mentioned fellowship comes from potency into act. So for Tusi, sociability creates the fellowship that actualized the possibility of perfection in human beings. Social bonds were properly enacted according to relational principles, which we call hierarchy. Thus, the first defining feature of the ruler in a virtuous government is that, quote, he holds fast to justice, treating his subjects as friends, filling the city with widespread goods, which consists of security, tranquility, mutual affection, justice, continence, graciousness, and loyalty. Tusi identifies the kind of love that a ruler should have towards a subject as, quote, a paternal love, while that of the subject for the ruler should be filial, the love of subjects for each other should be fraternal, so that the conditions of order may be preserved among them. Social bonds, properly enacted, could link people within virtuous polities, through which they could realize their perfection. So I'm going to come back to this familial language in a moment, but I just wanted to kind of go over some of the basics. And I think that you see similarities of this in a lot of different contexts. And in particular, there's similarities between the forms of exchange expected from servants and from friends. So Jürgen Paul has noted in 12th century Seljuk context that, quote, a standard element in letters addressed to the king or other high-ranking persons with whom the writer has concluded a bond of khidma is to express one's longing for the presence of a superior or lord. This feeling is called ishtiyaq, and it must be voiced in such letters. Ishtiyaq is a word that means yearning or desire. And the offering of yearning and affection for the addressee of the letter was a standard part of letters written among those we would more easily classify as friends. Indeed, Emma Flatt notes the same expression in 15th century friendship letters, such as between Mahmud Ghazvan, the Bahmani vizier, and the renowned Timurid man of letters, Abdurrahman Jami. Except in this case, who is the higher ranking person? Ghazvan and Jami were part of a mutually sustaining transregional network of men of learning and power, dissimilar in nature, in stature in relation to political power, but symbiotically dependent on one another. And I'll explain more about that in a moment. But I want to take a moment to address the fact that some may object that language as rhetoric is not an accurate indicator of what was really going on. But the presumed hermetic disjuncture between the imaginative and the material realms is a product of our own modern idea of empiricism. Historically, and maybe even now, there was an apparatic exchange between them, which made them mutually constitutive and sustaining. So Emma Flatt, for instance, has shown how metaphors appropriate to friendship referred to practices and activities within which conviviality actually took place. So to evoke inappropriate aesthetic forms of language was to manifest particular ethical forms of exchange. In the case of the epistolary friendships she looks at, the correct and deft expressions of friendship could create and thereby stand in for the physically proximate sociality expected of such relationships. Indeed, commemorations of all sorts were part of the obligations of friends, depending on the nature of the bond. These exchanges allowed the circulation of justice, and in some more perfect iterations of love, the more superior basis of social cohesion. So in medieval Islamic South Asian context, the concept of service can be divided into nokari or bandagi, and which the latter is understood, at least as Sunil Kumar has argued, to morph by the 16th century into khidmat. The terms are defined by different social statuses. So a nokar possessed prominent lineages and skills indicative of a higher standing than the bande, slave or not. However, he notes that the interpermeability of these respective positions was pretty noticeable, and that there was an intermediary category of the bande khas, or a special servant, that sort of trucked between the two. So numerous individuals could and did cross the line between bande and nokad, and bande literally means slave, and nokad means literally servant. And that they could, but you could transact between these categories based on educational accomplishments and accumulation of social bonds that built sturdy networks. He seeks to locate jural relations, noting that a host of factors prevent us from understanding ownership as disempowerment or abjection, and that status was relational, and therefore, quote, the question of whose servant or slave, for example, could throw an individual's status up for debate, right? So if you were the king's slave, you probably were commanding a whole lot of free men, basically. So I think that we can add that these notions are not limited to public service, as he calls it, but rather emerged out of broader social relations and embeddedness from within which they gain their traction. For instance, khidmat could also describe a student's relationship with a teacher. In the political context, khidmat is one where if the retainer exerted themselves correctly, then they could earn rights or recognize claims, which the ruler has to take into account. The ruler offers benefits and the retainer offers fidelity, exchanges facilitated by practices of companionship. So the bond of service took the household and thus kinship as a model and extended these reciprocal bonds outward to others. But instead of calling this Weberian patrimonialism, or as a mere reflection of Gramscian hegemonic culture driven by the self-interests of elites, let's step away from kind of hopelessly European and modern ideas, right? So I think that these European and modern concepts plague even studies of pre-modern and non-European forms of governance. So even in his otherwise excellent study of the Seljuks, Jürgen Paul is only able to call these servants vassals or rhetorical members of the household, in contrast to those who are real. The distinction is made according to legal status, while in the sources, all are part of khidma relations. And so my point is not that legal status was negligible, but we cannot take it as definitive of what was real. And treating it as such interrupts a continuum determined by customary regulation that I argue is far more significant. So service was a socially recognized relation that was part of a spectrum, including legally sanctioned relationships. So for instance, in early modern Persian, service was often, political service was often discussed as sighet, meaning form, shape, or mold, but in Islamic law, the proper way to offer a contract, and in Persian, also a word for mutta, or temporary marriage. So kinship must be understood as a variety of forms: alliance, companionship, connection, that entailed socially recognized privileges and obligations and could transmit meaning. In the Persianate, they were bounded by adab. So the law defined for us our milk siblings and prescribed inheritance and marriage relations, but adab signified what a sibling relationship should be, ideally one based on intimacy, trust, protection, and generosity, whose absence had to be accounted for when ideals were precluded. So I want to kind of I want to move on. And basically, my point in kind of bringing up the aporia between legal and customary forms of kinship provide an analogy for understanding other types of bonds. And the point is that relationships we consider real, either because of biological essentialism or some perceived consequence about how law impacts lives in ways that custom does not. I think that these relationships that we consider real are on a continuum with those we consider imagined, fictive, or even inconsequential. And yet historically, there are certain kinds of social practices of kin making, which create formal bonds that were broadly shared and transregionally intelligible, and could serve as the basis of political cohesion. And that's I'm pulling together this scholarship and kind of summarizing my own work here to make that point, because the little that's been written on friendship and companionship has barely touched discussion of the state in South Asian studies. And I think that that's a problem. And I think that this negligence has a particular stakes in South Asian and Islamic context more broadly. So as Europeans began to form a new discourse and aspire to different kinds of political forms, their customary and social practices endured, but went into something called private life. In formulating these new discourses, Europeans articulated their rational, legal, and bureaucratic forms of justice in contradistinction to the Orient and its ostensible despotisms. South Asian studies is only just now breaking away from response to such characterizations. And part of the problem is the inability to see the polysemy of kinship with other bonds as anything but patrimonialism, and its only alternative as the search for bureaucratic institutions. And that's what often the study of the state turns out to be. So this leaves us with a misleadingly depersonalized vision of political ethics and practice. To be clear, I'm not disavowing the importance of practices defined by expected norms of formally understood offices and positions, but the search for rationality has narrowed our gaze and relegated social relations and customary practices to the realm of the personal, idiosyncratic, and outright inconsequential. And so with that very long preface, I'd like to turn to the social forms of exchange that were part of the intimacies between men of power and men of learning. And just to kind of give a context, it's been argued by a variety of scholars that men of learning, such as scholars, jurists, and literati, were required for a court's own understanding of itself as a valid entity. So men of power needed men of learning, and these relations were as vital to medieval and early modern states as those between rulers and military subordinates. So these kinds of relationships were symbiotic. Men of learning could bestow multivalent prestige, while men of power could offer support and protection. Variations did exist, particularly with differences in age or status, but the invocation of love and friendship lent these service relations a kind of parity, particularly for those who drew their status from different bases. And so I'm going to kind of shift to the 18th century context in India and in Mughal, and the Mughals were Timurids, right? So the model of companionship between the man of learning, who I can call Fazil, and the man of power, or the Khan, or a noble, was both widespread and with precedent. So many learned persons who appear in commemorative texts as master poets are biographically depicted in terms of their students/patrons. So for instance, commemorations of Farid Dehlavi explain that, quote, he spent a long while cherished and respected in the companionship of nobles before he chose to don the clothes of a dervish at the end of his life. This meant that, quote, he lived without worldly attachments or appointments, but he did not live without the agitation of love and the burning fire of companionship. So that's just an example of how one man of learning is remembered. So for the learned, companionship with powerful men in the middle of one's life was a recognized trajectory, as was travel in the pursuit of knowledge earlier in life and withdrawal from the world later in life. But this withdrawal did not mean leaving behind companionship. At the end of his life, like in the middle, Farid could bestow benefits through companionship with powerful men who were at once students and patrons. So mirroring their learned companions, the life trajectories of accomplished nobles take the shape of a list of companions and teachers that, along with origins, defines them. The ideal manifestation of this companionship is summed up in this description of the elder Esa Khan, a mid-18th century Timurid office holder. After noting his serious disposition, his excellent progress, quote, in some of the usual sciences, his acquaintance with music, his precise poetry, perceptive mind, his ability to compose prose well in both Persian and Arabic, this list concludes by noting his distinction, quote, in the sphere of sincere attachments. Esa Khan was someone who fostered companions and nurtured men of excellence. He was a great patron of learned men, although significantly, his biographer uses descriptive terms of solicitous friendships. So one of Ishaq Khan's primary beneficiaries, the scholar Khana Arzu, declares, quote, "During 20-some years in his service, this poor Arzu was true in his sincere attachment and devoted bondage. For this reason, he, Ishaq Khan, observed the most perfect kindnesses towards Arzu." So to be a devoted friend was to create relationships with men of learning whom Ishaq Khan supported, spent time with, and learned from, an act which in its ideal form was a sign of his own nobility, signifying virtuous self-cultivation. Patronage of such men also furthered the creation and spread of knowledge at a more general level, enabling and signifying a society's virtuousness. So this type of companionship contained with it the exchanges of patronage and mentorship. So let's return to Farid and talk about his relationship with his most famous companion, Valeh Dagestani. As an aspiring poet and noble of high position, Valeh benefited from the prestige of patronizing and learning from Farid, the ethical learned scholar and poet par excellence. So Valeh calls him, quote, "the exemplar among the learned and virtuous of the age and the chief poet of the world." But he simultaneously overlays the friendship that he describes, referring to Farid as his dear brother. So there's also a kind of familial overlay to the language. Next, Valeh, who was actually a migrant who fled Esfahan after the collapse of Safavid rule, articulates the nature of their relationship. And he says, that their special intimacy is such that it is him who applies a salve to the afflicted breast of my thoughts and the heart of my sorrow in this miserable place that is exile. And Valeh elaborates that 2 or 3 days a month, he is seized by a desire to leave and migrate to be reunited with his loved ones. And this is in Esfahan. At those times, Farid is, quote, "never without the exertions of amity or the passions of love." So this virtuous form of love and social intercourse is one that says as much about the substance of Farid as does his learning. And this was a dyad and also a form constitutive of overlapping circles of Persianate societies. So Farid took the role of servant, teacher, friend to more than one beloved. And Valeh even actually explains that, quote, "there are times when he is engaged with 5 or 6 beloveds," and he uses the word mashu. And sometimes, having reduced his engagement, he is content with one beloved. Farid rendered other services to his friend and patron, such as composing poetry to mark significant occasions, such as for his wedding. Farid also authorized Valeh's poetry by collecting it into a divan, or a sort of collected book. And more significantly, at Valeh's request, Farid composed Masnaviya Valeh Sultan, setting to verse the story of Valeh's tragically unrequited love for his cousin Khadija Sultan, which is a tale loosely following the narrative structure of Layla and Majnun. As with its more famous model, Farid's story focuses on the pain of Valeh, his beloved friend, rather than the heteroerotic love story. In an early section describing the reason for composing the poem, Farid explains being in a state of restless disquiet, unable to bring his desire to compose to fruition. He then receives a summons from his friend Valeh. With professions of love and admiration, he hastens to his friend's presence, where Valeh confides his own agitated and disturbed state over his lost love, Khadija. With many declarations of love, and some of them are, quote, "O direction of my prayer, it is from you that all my works pour forth. O my heart, O you who is the soul of 2 worlds." These are them talking about each other. Farid pledges to ease his friend's pain by setting Valeh's love story to verse. So the text comes into being at this point as the mutual fulfillment of the needs of the 2 friends, an act of their love for one another. And there are numerous copies of this text. There are 2 published manuscripts in particular, and they're really just photocopies of manuscripts. dated within a year of each other immediately after the text composition, 1748 and 1749, and they're both copied by the same scribe, Muhammad Rafi, signed at the end by Farid himself, right? So this is actually Farid's kind of signature here. So this one, this is a page from a section it's a pretty long section on the reasons for composing the book, which is a common part of Masnavis. And this is where the story of how the text came into being, which features their friendship's role, is contained. And the common scribe and the author's signature on this manuscript as well indicates a concerted production of manuscripts. And this particular copy ended up in Iran, even though the entire text was composed in Delhi, right? And this is a, this is a later manuscript, and all of these copies are relatively modest, and they look like they circulated outside of courts, because this is pretty much the time in which central courts were devolving into regional centers. So Farid's gift of the Divan and the Masnavi were an articulation of gratitude to his powerful friend's care and reverence. Okay, and I will conclude with this last example. So material exchanges made social bonds, without which they would not be recognized or maintained. The fulfillment of obligations of care and gratitude were made in the form of exchanges that created and circulated texts as objects, compositions, and expressions. What does this generative context mean for how we are to receive and engage with them? So let's take as our example, Ghulam Hussein Tabatabai's Siyar al-Mutaakhirin, which is perhaps the most widely read, cited, and referenced text on 18th century Indian history and politics. This text is identified and read as a chronicle. And amongst its renowned features, it is what has been called the first critique of colonialism, penned in the 1780s. This reading is a little bit complicated by the fact that the text is dedicated to the infamous Governor General of the East India Company, Warren Hastings. And the text was written while Tabatabai was both employed by the East India Company, but also in danger of losing his family property holdings in the company's web of debt and taxation. Thus, given that Tabatabai wrote his text as a man of letters who enjoyed companionship and patronage from several high-ranking company members, including Hastings himself, what are we to do with this text? It was a gift, though not one without the bitter pill of instruction, as the famous Sheikh Saadi puts it, to new and somewhat ignorant rulers. This tradition of instructing rulers through both praise and exhortation via exempla and poetry was a long tradition going back almost as long as Persian men of letters had existed. Tabatabai identifies the problems of East India Company misrule significantly as a lack of social intimacy. Such a lack prevents their rule, in his estimation, from being anything but a failure of governance and a disaster for the populace. So after elaborating the demise of the Bengali Nawab and the rise of the East India Company's rule, Tabatabai explains the East India Company's structure, their ruling council, as well as that of English Parliament. And he says, quote, they have strange regulatory procedures that are extremely refined and good at the core of their administration. However, until now, for the people and governance of this region, they have been satisfied to implement the regulations and procedures of this place as whatever they have heard from their functionaries and their own underlings. These they have entered into books, and it is the extent to which they know what is just and correct, but without knowing the basis according to which the regulations and procedures were established. So after bemoaning that the English are not learning these bases, Tabatabai states, quote, in short, because the gates of companionship/conversation are closed, and there is no association with the people of this country by the English, the two sides are not informed aware of the conditions of one another. This lack of social intercourse results in a fundamental lack of knowledge, deleterious because it prevents them from knowing what will lead to the contentment of the people and the order and prosperity of the kingdom and the world. Entering incomplete and superficial information into books, which then stand in for sohbat, reviewing these books in solitude, what we might call the shift to bureaucratic rationalism, registers here as the cause of dissatisfaction and disorder. So something very important is missing among the English, the inclination for intimacy, a necessary predisposition for justice. And he says, quote, "There is no yearning among the English lords for conversing of meetings with and listening to the stories," and he uses the word hekayat, "of the common people." The language is significant because of its resonance with other concepts and usages in the broader Persian tradition, such as sohbat, right? The sociability that enables transmission and reception of knowledge, as well as listening to stories or hekayat, which are specifically those that illustrate a point requiring engagement on the listener's part to incite understanding and the proliferation of moral benefits. The desire for this kind of intercourse is the only way for even, quote, the wise among the naturally good-natured English, he has to sort of lay it on a little thick, to gain awareness of what will ease the people and achieve prosperity in the domain. So these statements serve as the preface for Tabatabai's description of how just rule has been dispensed by previous Persianate rulers. In other words, social intercourse and the speaking and listening it engenders is crucial, appropriate, and beneficial political knowledge. Its lack by the British is what sets them apart as conquerors different from those who came before. And this is contrary to both colonial and current modern nationalist narratives about conquest. So desire for this type of intercourse must therefore be instilled in the new rulers, marked by their alterity to Persianate Asia. Ennobled by this knowledge, men of letters such as Tabatabai, defined by their lineages of service, needed to provide the continuity vital in times of transition to new rulers, even those who were ignorant of the proper forms of governance. So how shall we receive Tabatabai's gift, this warning, this means of instruction? Perhaps you might take a cue from Sheldon Pollock, who reminds us that there is more than one way to engage with the text. I would argue that taking the text's social life seriously requires reading it for both its historical and analytic value. So this is my answer to the, quote, great intellectual challenge of what Pollock has called a critical philology, a practice of reading the text for first its own meaning and then its tradition of reception, which leads to, quote, the hermeneutical necessity of asking, what possibility does the text give me to understand my own being? We must receive it as a gift, examine its spirit, because to begin with, texts are not dead letters, particularly in early modern Islamic contexts. They were occult agents that actualized meaning in the world. With Tabatabai's Sayar, we might need to take social intimacy as political ethics seriously and think about what analysis of the state, the meaning of politics and of conquest might look like if we do. It might give us a view of homo amicus, which is the desiring subject of adab and its justice, rather than assume and read for the now de facto transhistorical homo economicus, who did everything according to a very modern and capitalist rational self-interest. We examine our own desire to find a rational, a bureaucratic state in other times and places. Homo amicus, on the other hand, came into being through habituated social practices or adab or proper form of being in the world and with the world according to one's position in it. Many of these habits were practices of exchange. We may think of them as gifts, as objects or acts transacted between people to create moral meaning, to make it present and realized. Thus, men with power in the world made it possible for men of learning to produce and propagate knowledge which they received for themselves and all the others to whom they were connected. The enactment and thus realization of this relation produced texts, compositions, practices, meanings. They were words and deeds that brought virtue to the world, whether as admonishment, warning, example, or incitement. Thus, the knowledge that makes possible just rule and harmonious social order requires certain kinds of intimacies, which British rule interrupted in the political sphere at least. perhaps the only way to rethink the relations of service and friendship, of politics and society outside the continuing strictures of Eurocentrism is to take them seriously as gifts of intimacy with their circulatory spirit of moral and material exchanges, as Marcel Mauss puts it. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Dr. Kia, for that fantastic talk. I've written a lot of notes and a few questions, but I will first of all hand over to our discussant, Dr. Balan, and then open up the floor for questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Manakia, for this wonderful, wonderful talk. Lots of food for thought. I also have about 2 pages of notes and questions, but I'll keep my remarks very brief because I know a lot of people want to ask questions as well. And we have a wonderful audience from all across Stony Brook for this talk. So first of all, I want to say this was a wonderful way of walking us through the complexity of a world without firm boundaries, a world defined by overlapping networks, lineages, and identities. And I thought this was a very important intervention. And I would like you at some point to speak, if you can, a little bit more about how this complicates our idea of the modern world, and especially the early modern world, and how that sort of gets us closer to notions of the global in the 18th century in particular. I'm sure a lot of people would want to maybe hear more about this. Also, I really appreciated, and as a medievalist in particular, your idea of friendship as not just a social bond of obligation and service, but as constituting political relationships and indeed political formation itself. There's been such a rich body of scholarship on this for both the medieval Islamic world and sort of other parts of the medieval world, including Europe, that have looked at sort of how friendship structured political union, right? And what was once called vassalage, no one really uses this concept uncritically anymore, is really in many ways bonds of obligation between various groups of people, including men of learning and men of power. So in some respects, I think a lot of medieval Europeanists would really benefit from the frameworks you're introducing here to counteract, as you mentioned, the very modern empiricism that sometimes characterizes approaches to the field for medieval Europe itself. I also really appreciated how you showed us how friendship, this word sohbat, which you're defining as friendship, was such a complicated concept. And I have so much questions on this, but I have a very simple one that I'll start with. What's the opposite of friendship in this world? Is it enmity or is it indifference? What would be the opposite of this? I think that's a good way maybe to think through the implications of this for social relations. And then I promise one more question and then I'll end. I am really, really interested in hearing a bit more about this concept of sort of homosociality, since you are talking about men and men of power and men of religion. And I'm wondering where sort of women enter the equation in particular, especially given what you called kin making. I think that was the word, or kinship making. So where does marriage fall in here? Where does bonds of sort of matrilineal ties, for example, come in here? Can someone claim a tie of power or learning through their matrilineal ancestor, as they do in the Middle Ages, or does that sort of shift away? Does this new world that's being constituted sort of in Persian adab shift away from a world in which sort of those kind of boundaries are fluid? And I'll save some more questions for later, but thank you so much for this. It really definitely complicated my view of this topic. I thought I knew a little bit about the early modern world, but I really want to thank you for this. This was a fantastic, fantastic talk. Thank you.
Should I address those or should I wait?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
I really appreciate your thoughts. I wondered if you could just clarify the first one where you asked me to think about the sort of how this what I'm arguing complicates our understanding of the early modern world / global. I mean, is this in reference to the bit in the beginning where I basically said the so-called global early modern?
I'm just curious how this framework will, what you're foreseeing, what your larger intervention is vis-a-vis global history as it's currently sort of, we're living in a moment right now where the global has re-entered the conversation in a lot of ways. Global Middle Ages, for example, I'm sure you've seen a lot of these debates. I'm curious whether you foresee yourself intervening in those conversations or you're more interested in having like a separate sort of set of discussions. That was really where I was coming from.
Well, I mean, the kind of work that I do and the focus on the Persianate, it's sort of an intermediary scale, right? It's one of those things that fits in between the regional and the global. And I guess one of my issues, but I've been obviously reading and speaking with many, many colleagues who consider themselves more global historians, which I don't necessarily. And I guess part of the problem for me is twofold. One is at the level of topic, global always means plus Europe, right? And in the Persianate context, really before the second half of the 18th century, you just like, when you're looking at Persianate context, you just cannot justify thinking about, you know, at least in the realm of culture, Europe is not important, right? And then, but automatically it doesn't become global anymore. And I find that to be a little bit insidious, because for a lot of the people in that world, that was the world. They were, you know, like from China to the Ottoman regions of Europe or North Africa, that was the world. That was enough. That was global, right? The other issue that I've had some, and I'm still struggling with kind of articulating where I stand on this. The other issue I've always had is the things that make the early modern or the medieval shared almost always seem to be things that start with or are defined in the European context and then searched for elsewhere. And one of the things that tends to happen, at least in what I've been reading, and you know, this can be anything from global historians to economic historians to people writing connected histories to whatever, is that there is a too easy process of translation that takes place, right? So if there is a kind of sense of millenarianism in Europe, and there is something that might look like it and might not, in India, it just gets called millenarianism without it. And I feel like that's a bit too quick, because there is a kind of tendency, I think, to say, well, that looks like this, and therefore it's the same thing. And one of the things that happens is that the other kinds of concepts and ideas and processes that it may be embedded in become amputated, that don't fit the original idea. And so I find it a little bit too precipitous. And so all I want is to urge a little bit of slowing down, and to engage in a more self-reflective process of translation and justification for, and to account for incommensurability. Where in the process of searching for a kind of common global early modern, and all of these things happened and it was the same, you know, it might have happened differently in different places, but it's still somehow the same thing, right? Is to think about, you know, how do we account for incommensurability? How do we account for what's not the same, or what doesn't make sense, or what disrupts equivalences? So, I mean, that's one issue. I really like your I really like your question about the opposite of sohbat. I mean, I don't know if I would call sohbat friendship, but I would call sohbat companionship, right? Because, and I think that you can have sohbat with enemies too, right? And you were actually supposed to keep them around you to a certain degree. And because they were more dangerous when you couldn't see what they were doing, right? But I think indifference, and for me, it was actually very interesting to see the critique of the British, not because it's a big surprise that the British were seen to be disruptive and really strange and different, but because of the way in which the fact that they just wanted to go and write things down into books and then look at the books by themselves was just so bizarre, and was actually seen as a real problem politically, because they felt uncomfortable being in these giant rooms. And I don't know if I hit my last slide, but they were really famously uncomfortable for going and holding darbar and sitting in these big rooms with like 100 people and it was loud, and they were, there are constant reports in the colonial archives of these British officials basically being like, okay, I can't deal with this, and leaving their munshi and going in the next room and saying, just have everybody write their petition down on a piece of paper and I'll review it later. Right? And so I would maybe say, instead of indifference, maybe withdrawal is the opposite of sohbat, depersonalization and rationalization, right? Put it in a petition, fill out this form. Right? Instead of, hey, let's sit down and tell me your story, and it's a great question about women. And I really like that. And I think that's very important, because this is it is men, right? And son is man, right? It's not humankind. But I do think that one of the things that I found fascinating is that we do have scholarship and mention up through even the 20th century. And here we can think about Simin Daneshvar's novel, Saveshun, right? Where you have a practice which sounds a lot like Alan Bray's wedded brother. And it's called Khahar Khandegi, right? And it's like an adopted sister. But it's taking a vow, Khandegi, you're vowing sisterhood. And it's something that happened between women. And it was one of those, and there's been some scholarship on it. Particularly Catherine Babayan has written about one such relationship where she can't really figure out if there's anything sexual going on there. But we have a female Haji who goes way out of her way on the way to Hajj to go visit her sister, her wedded sister, who she's been separated from for a long time. And this is part of the physical journey that is overlaying the journey of Hajj, right? So we don't know enough about those practices, but we do know that there are some similarities, but there are also certain ways in which women inhabited gender and inhabited relationships to power that were fundamentally different from men. And we don't know enough about them. But I do think one of the major interventions in gender studies has been the greater attention to the way that age stratifies gender for women in a very, very specific and important way. And so older women were able to play particular kinds of roles that were maybe more difficult for younger women. Maternal lineage is another thing I'm really interested in. And one thing that I've been very surprised by is thinking about and with the importance, for instance, not just of maternal lineages, and it can, you can start talking about grandmothers even, but the way in which Sayyid status was acknowledged by men passed maternally. And that seems to actually be pretty common in the context that I've been looking at, and not really disputed at all. So someone who is a paternal Sayyid will call somebody else Mir, which is a title to mark a Sayyid who has it through their maternal grandmother. And that's kind of interesting. And I have just been collecting instances of it. And again, we don't really know enough to explain that. But I have spoken with colleagues also who know that this is the case also in the 16th century in Central Asia as well. So I don't know if I got all of this, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I'll open up the floor to general questions. So feel free to use the raise hand function or type in the chat, and we'll go with whoever's first. I'll give people a minute. I have to say, while we're waiting for questions to come in, I loved the stuff about the British, coming from the UK myself. So that was very funny to me.
I don't know if this is, I mean, I realize that some of the scholarship and the push that I'm putting on the historiography is specifically a kind of South Asian studies context, but I don't really feel like it's that different. I mean, there's still this kind of specter of Oriental despotism that everybody's trying to respond to when they're talking about states. And one of the things I was just thinking about is, well, how can we just stop reacting to that?
So
I
we
see
had
two hands up, yeah.
Yeah, we had Kaveh first and then Nicholas.
Let's see. Did I? Yes, I unmuted. So, I mean, this is just a kind of off the cuff thought, but you're talking about the British being portrayed as strange in this way, and I wonder if how symmetrical their sort of withdrawal was, if that was reflective of, to what extent was that just how they did things, and to what extent was that something they did specifically in South Asia? And due to, I mean, I realize the answer to that may not be sort of immediately available, but you know, was that maybe some kind of a power move, like to assert control, or could language barriers have played a role in that as well? That's a really interesting kind of point.
I think that's just how they did things, right? I don't think that was something special they were doing there. I mean, I think we have to remember that the East India Company also, when they took over Bengal, right, they were a joint stock company. And then all of a sudden they ended up ruling this part of the world that was many times the size of Britain, and with many more people. And that was a big shock. And they were basically a company with an army. And so, you know, they had a kind of business institutional framework, and they had like a military administration, but then all of a sudden they get the richest province in India. That's what Bengal was. Like the revenues from Bengal were insane. And I think that, I mean, the other thing I think that's important to keep in mind is that when you look at the scholarship on England itself, from the late 17th century onward, like for the 100 years before the British take over Bengal, their own governance practices shift hugely, right? And God, I can't remember his name, but he wrote a book called Sinews of Power, and it talked about the different and changing expectations of governance and practices of power that took place kind of across the 18th century. Right. So when the East India Company gets into Bengal, and not all of them just, you know, stay stiff and go into the other room, right? Some of them learn Persian. Some of them start to try and keep companionship. And actually Warren Hastings was one of these people, right? But you can see what happens to that and how it's received in the context of the UK, you know, starting with, but not limited to, his infamous trial, right? So he's actually brought up on charges of corruption because he had basically gone native in ways that were deemed to be immoral and unacceptable. So there is a kind of incommensurability there in governance practices. And Hastings really pushes the envelope, and he starts patronizing Persian men of learning, and he starts doing things more the way that he's supposed to, at least according to the kind of Persianate ideas, and it really does not go down well at home, right?
Nicholas Lazaro.
Hi, am I unmuted? No, good. Thank you. The talk was really, really phenomenal. Thank you very much. I wanted to kind of draw it down back into the Persianate specifically for a second. So as sort of a regional set of social norms, right, that's taken as a regional set of social norms, how much is there a sort of core periphery relationship maybe between, say, what you might call the central Iranian or the southern Iranian plateau and, say, places like North India, Central Asia, stuff like that? Because I was reading a paper of yours actually earlier, you know, sort of because the talk was happening, about these different travel writers, and one of them, who had been from Isfahan, was pretty explicitly standoffish towards, say, the Sultanate. And I was curious how much of that core periphery relationship sort of existed throughout these set of social norms.
Okay, thank you. I think that in terms of these social norms, these were transregionally recognized and practiced. And one of the things that I kind of, and I know who you're talking about, this is a Sheikh Hazin, right? And Hazin was kind of a famous snob, but he was also part of a set of literary disputes over who had the authority to dictate poetic idiom, right? But these were disputes specific to Delhi. And he was a migrant, and that's bound up in a whole set of struggles for kind of poetic and cultural power. But it was something that, and he was claiming authority because he said, oh, you know, they don't know, these people here don't know how to speak. But the proponents of this debate were people, I mean, it wasn't split based on if you were from Iran or India. It was really an aesthetic position, right? Over idiomatic style and usage and the acceptable bounds of kind of poetic innovation. So you can't really, it's been attempted to make it an Iranian or Indian style, but you really, if you look at the proponents, it just doesn't add up, right? I do think that these social norms are really, really widely legible. And part of this is because you have such a huge circulation of people circulating in this area, right? I mean, at any given point in North India, something like 30 to 40% of the, you know, Hindustani office holders and people in the court were from Central Asia and Iran, right? And circular migration was also very common. And we're not just talking about poets and things like this. It's craftsmen. It's all kinds of people, merchants, right? Sufis were famously footloose. So I think in terms of, I also think it's important to make a different distinction between social norms that were widely accepted and understood, and then what were, for the most part, localized fights over who had authority to dictate how certain things should be done, right? And so you did have those kinds of disputes kind of pop up at different points of time and in different places, but that actually doesn't very much touch the fact that, you know, depending on how far out of the city a welcoming entourage comes to greet you is how much honor they're showing you. Like, everyone could understand what this meant, right? If they were being honored, if they were being slighted, right? Things like that.
Our next question is from Matt, and then after that we have Sarah.
Hey, Mana. Yeah. Just a quick question. We talked a little bit about this before, but you know, the cosmological question. You know, God is love, all this classic Western stuff. To what extent do you see the whole God is love play out? You know, again, we've talked about this a little bit before, but you know, based on your further research, you know, is this a like, you know, Empedocles, or, you know, love and strife, or, you know, love is the basis of reality. This is obviously a Sufi thing. It's very much Ibn Arabi and all these folks, but it's also just a scientific statement of fact. To what extent do you see that as a social, like a lived social reality?
So I would put it a different way. So the God is love. I mean, that has like a super Christian meaning, right? I feel like what's keyed here is more tawhid, right? So it's more about synthesis, harmony, and union. And so the idea is that certain things are relationally appropriate, which makes them in harmony, and creates kind of cohesion and synthesis, right? And we could call that love. I guess that's love. That's and that manifests muhabbat, right? But the logic is the cosmology of tawhid, right? The fact that there are many multiple things, but if they are understood the right way and put together in the right order, they all harmonize into one truth. And it is like, it is such a common sense, like you don't have to be a Sufi or go into any of that. I think Sufism is one articulation of it, right? And your work shows how this is actually built into a mathematical understanding of the cosmos more largely. It's reality, basically. But I wanted to kind of show how the way in which certain social acts inhabited this reality and were part of this reality, right? It wasn't just some stuff you read about in a book or something you knew about God when you thought about God, right? Or when you were looking at trying to figure out what was going to happen by looking at the stars, right? It was also something you lived and breathed and inhabited and embodied.
Well, speaking of embodying, you're talking about bondage. To what extent is this a Tawhidi bondage? Just as a follow-up thing.
I mean, it's the same, right? I mean, the idea is you want to attain proximity, and the idea, I mean, I always thought it was interesting, this idea of the free, autonomous, sovereign individual. I mean, in the earlier context would just be an absolute horror, right? Like to be Bihamechis is like a terribly abject state of being. You want to be embedded and sort of circled around with as many close bonds as possible, right? And that was a good thing. And it didn't make people upset that before you left town, you had to go and do leave taking, for instance. You couldn't just bail, right? No, almost nobody could just leave. You had to do leave taking to the particular people that you were bonded to, for instance, right? And that was not an infringement of your freedom. I mean, and it's so hard for us to think about this, right? But yeah, I mean, there's this idea that when you're sort of secure and built up and connected to other people, things are good, right? And it's not just rational self-interest of being safe, right?
I would love to interject and talk all about philosophy, and Tusi, you talked a lot about Tusi. I'd love to start bringing all of that in, but I do want to give the floor to Dr. Sarah Lipton, which I think she'll probably be our last question today. And maybe after we close up officially, I can share some of my thoughts and questions.
Okay, thank you, Rosie, and thank you, Dr. Kia. I really, really enjoyed your talk. It was thoughtful and elegant and interesting. I'm a medievalist like Mohammed Balan, and I guess I have two questions, one quite specific and one kind of like so big and broad, I'll throw it out there and maybe not require you to answer. The specific one is, I'd like to ask you about the word trust and to what extent the word trust or the Persianate equivalent or equivalents come into play when people discuss Muhabbat and the kind of relationships you're mentioning. And I say this because in my own work, I work especially on the 13th century and the transition from an oral to a textual culture, and actual people being distressed about walking out of a conversation in order to look at a book is the kind of thing that comes up. And very frequently, the rupturing of trust effected by a textual culture is mentioned. And I was wondering if that comes up in your material. And I'll quick throw out the big one that I don't necessarily expect you to address, just to sort of explain maybe the first one, which is, I think like Muhammad, as Muhammad implied, so, I mean, everything you talked about just resonated so much with me as a medievalist, and the idea of love being very much a component of friendship between men of power and also between men of power and men of learning. I was actually just teaching the biography of the Anglo-Saxon king Alfred, written by a scholar he invited, really insisted, come live at his court. The scholar, after doing a little bit of teaching, wanted to go home, and Alfred said, no, 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 I love you too much, I cannot give up your friendship. But I'm very disturbed by the extent that it resonates. I don't want to imply that, oh, there's nothing specific about the Persianate context, and I certainly don't want to do an Orientalist move that 18th century Mughal Empire is the same as 8th century England. So I'm just wondering if we can think about what we do with that. And like what I'm groping for is, as opposed to using maybe early modern or Enlightenment rationalizing Europe as the kind of dominant paradigm against which everybody else has to push back, I mean, maybe it's just time we look at that as a complete anomaly in in kind of global human relations. That's the big question.
Well, I appreciate your big question. I mean, I wish it was as easy, but I just feel like, I mean, part of the issue for me is that we are located in a modern moment, right, that has a particular kind of language. I have not read a single discussion of the Timurid state in North India that doesn't call it patrimonial. So, I mean, like everyone can talk about how like, well, nobody talks like that anymore, except they do. And it's really at the level of language. And, you know, in my first book, I had the same problem where when I came up with the idea back when I was a graduate student, I said, well, I really want to write against, you know, nationalist ways of understanding place and origin. And, you know, I actually had advisors who pushed against me and said, well, everybody knows that like those nationalist terms shouldn't be used to understand those earlier periods. But that still didn't deal with the problem of methodological nationalism, right? So there is the very big stated disavowal at an explicit level, but I feel like it's much harder to do in actuality just because of our own saturation and the saturation of the language that we have to use. Which really requires kind of going back and thinking about how we're engaging with our sources. And for instance, for me, and just to speak for a second a little bit more about, we are still dealing with our source materials, you know, from a late 19th century positivist point of view, where they're these dead objects that we establish mastery over. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do with this work is thinking about what would it mean for me to engage with these texts differently, right? If I were to think about them according to where they came from and how they were read and received, what would that mean, and what kind of different writing and engagement with it would I have to make, right? And I mean, that's just an example, and I'm still kind of working it out. But I just feel like, you know, we're still using this particular relationship, subject-object relationship, and that comes from a particular moment, and it has lots of things embedded within it. Your question about trust, I mean, there's a lot of different words that we could translate as trust, right? And one of them is the word that I translated as fidelity, right? Vafa. Vafadari, having vafa, you know, and there's also words that get translated as sincere, right? And then there's words that more often get translated as trust, etiqad. I don't know. I'd have to go back and see to what degree. I mean, a lot of these words, some of them, also kind of are like being true and being faithful and being right, not faithful in the Christian sense, but being faithful, loyal. I mean, these are translation problems, right? And I guess one of the things that kind of has to be done is thinking about what words that we could translate as trust are in what semantic fields with other kinds of concepts. Right. I do think this idea of sincerity is very important, sincerity and loyalty, which is really the words that I see most commonly with words of amity.
Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you for this rich discussion. Just, I don't know, a brief kind of comment, follow up from Sarah's question and your response it seems like a lot of what you're working on is, or like the kind of underlying like deeper ideas, is the need to really embody ourselves in our texts and almost like move beyond our own or like the contemporary like moment and way of thinking of the world, which is hard. It's like we have to, I think this is true for anybody that studies a different language, a different time period. We have to like extract ourselves from our own time and place and like way of thinking and like try to like become from the time and like language that we're studying. I don't know if that's making a lot of sense. I feel like this probably needs a much longer discussion. But thank you, Dr. Kia, and thank you to everybody who attended. I will now hand over to the director of IGS, Dr. Reina.
Thank you, Rosabelle, and thank you, Manakia, for this enlightening talk, this very important intervention, to quote Mohammed Balan earlier, referring to your lecture. And thanks to our audience for attending and asking great questions. A special thanks to Dr. Mohammed Balan, currently on research leave at Notre Dame University, but back at Stony Brook University for this special occasion. Thank you for co-moderating this event with our Institute Fellow, Dr. Rosabelle Ansari. As a transdisciplinary forum, we value our partnership with history around globalization issues, and we welcome partnerships with all departments that one way or another study issues of globalization. Through our institute, we run an academic degree, a BA in Globalization and International Relations, GLI, with 6 tracks and covering the world with 8 interaction areas. So the topics we can present to you as representative of what we're covering in this degree and intellectually via our institute events like this one are plentiful. A recording will be made available soon via YouTube, and we'll email you the link. You can share it as you please. If you'd like to hear the previous talks of this special series on globalization across time and place, or learn more about how we can apply this notion of globalization to the early modern period, consult our website and you will have access to those recordings. We look forward to hosting you all again here at the Institute for Globalization Studies. A culmination of sorts for this special fall series on globalization across time and space will be a Sir Run Show sponsored talk given by Dr. Michael Gomez from NYU sometime in the spring. Topic and details to be announced soon. Now, our special spring lecture series will focus on a thoroughly different angle of globalization, back to the contemporary and probably the most pressing matter, the environment and climate change and its implications on populations such as migration, displacements, etc. It's being co-organized by 2 members of the Institute Faculty Advisory Board, Nancy Heemstra from the Department of Women's and Gender and Sexuality Studies, whose work is on migration, and Jeff Santa Ana, whose work is on climate change and its impact on indigenous populations. He's from the English department here at Stony Brook. We'll be working out the details of the program over the break. Everything will be announced via email, our website, and our social media, so stay tuned. Also, please consider following us on Twitter if you'd like to see where we're at on a daily basis. Thank you again, happy holiday, and see you in the spring.